Where in the heck is Earthworm Jim 4? Earthworm Jim originally came out in 1994 for both the Sega Mega Drive and the Super Nintendo. It was a major hit, selling millions of copies, and it put Shiny Entertainment, a young upstart game studio led by David Perry, on the map. Where on the map? Right there in Laguna Beach, California. Now that's pretty fancy. Earthworm Jim is the creation of a former DreamWorks animator and comic book artist by the name of Doug TenNapel. I think that's his name. TenNapel? TenNapel? And I know what you're thinking. What kind of a name is TenNapel? Well, it's an infamous one, because Doug TenNapel is a Christian conservative, and unfortunately for him, he's an outspoken one. But back in 1994, before we went after guys like Doug TenNapel for believing and talking about all the wrong things, he was just one of the guys at Shiny Entertainment, and he provided David Perry and his team of computer nerds with a truly inspired creative direction that I assume had nothing to do with drugs or alcohol. I mean, just look at TenNapel's characters here. This is the evil queen Slug for a Butt, and this is his main character, a worm in a superhero suit. In the 90s, the line between creative comedy and actual mental illness were not entirely clear. See Ren and Stimpy for more info.
Call the police.
Anyway, Doug TenNapel's second big idea was Earthworm Jim 2 in 1995, which was also held in high regard by critics and was yet another big hit for Shiny Entertainment. So at this point in time, Shiny had become a proven hit-making development studio with 2 blockbusters under its belt. There was a cartoon show based on their main character and a cool toy line on top of that. So Shiny Entertainment president David Perry did what anyone else would do in a situation like this. He sold the company and the rights to Earthworm Jim over to Interplay. He did what? Why? Yes, toward the end of 1995, David Perry sold Shiny Entertainment to Interplay. He retained his title and position and went on to make games like MDK, and Doug TenNapel left to start his own studio called The Neverhood. From that point on, the future of Earthworm Jim was in other people's hands, and it was never the same. Interplay contracted a small Scottish studio called This Interactive to develop Earthworm Jim 3D for both the Sony PlayStation and N64 in 1999. There was also a PC version. The game was a critical and commercial failure, and outside of a Game Boy game and a few remakes and releases of the original titles, Earthworm Jim 3D was basically the last entry in the series. That was over 20 years ago. Shiny Entertainment was never the same without Doug TenNapel, and Interplay would eventually collapse. In 2001, the company was bought by Harvey Kine, I think that's how you say his name, and his French game company called Titus Interactive, famous for such classics as Superman 64. Shiny was sold off to Infogrames, but since Earthworm Jim was owned by Interplay, Harvey Kine and Titus retained ownership of the IP. By 2005, Titus Interactive was also bankrupt, and Harvey Kine more or less exited the game industry as a developer, but he managed to retain ownership of Interplay's many IPs by selling off the rights to the game Fallout to Bethesda in 2007, who went on to produce the seminal classic Fallout 3. In 2016, Interplay made news again when it announced that it was selling off 70 of its classic game IPs that it acquired back in the 90s and early 2000s, and included in that sale was supposed to be the rights to Earthworm Jim. However, it doesn't seem like the sale ever went through because the Interplay website still exists, and it's rife with many old gaming licenses, including a very prominent Earthworm Jim. Then out of nowhere in 2019, Tommy Tallarico, the guy that did the excellent soundtrack for the original Earthworm Jim games back in the 90s, revealed that most of the entire original Earthworm Jim development team, including himself, David Perry, and Doug TenNapel, were all back together to develop Earthworm Jim 4 as an exclusive game for Tommy Tallarico's eccentric and controversial new game console, the Intellivision Amico. Well, at least Tommy Tallarico gave the impression that the original development team was all back together to do this. Watching the Intellivision live stream, I'm left with the impression that the men in this room, who in fact really are Earthworm Jim's original development team, may have shown up to this live stream event for other purposes, and that we're meant to falsely infer that these guys are actually going to literally be making Earthworm Jim for the Amico. The reality seems to be that some of these guys, like Michael Dietz, who who works at Intellivision as an art director, will actually be making the game, and that most of the other men present for this announcement have only come for a kind of friendly reunion. David Perry, who's front row with Tommy Tallarico for instance, presents no sign anywhere that he's even currently involved in video game development at all. He's pretty much moved on. Absent from the presentation is also Harvey Kine and Interplay, who still seem to own the rights to Earthworm Jim, at least the character. Indeed, barely recently in late 2021, Interplay announced that they were producing a new Earthworm Jim television series, and they even launched an official Earthworm Jim Twitter account to promote the project called The Real Earthworm Jim. But nowhere does Interplay mention or acknowledge an Earthworm Jim 4 video game. And indeed, it's been about a year and a half since Tommy Tallarico's live stream with ex-Shiny staff, and the silence regarding the game has been deafening. The only meaningful update was a 39-second clip uploaded to YouTube in August of 2020 that showed Earthworm Jim running around a beach with some voice samples uttering nonsense. It wasn't very impressive, and it really doesn't tell us much about the game in question. Around that same time, however, GameIndustry.biz published an article accusing Earthworm Jim creator Doug TenNapel of being both racist and homophobic after TenNapel criticized BLM during a podcast. TenNapel compared BLM and the violent demonstrations that were all across America at the time to the actions of Hitler and fascists during Germany, which is an awful comparison made by way too many people. Stop everything. Guys, can we all just agree to stop accusing everyone we don't like of being Hitler? It is so silly and betrays a lack of sophistication. Plus, as it turns out, BLM has a lot more in common with Jim Bakker and Joel Osteen. It's a culty scam created to make its leaders millionaires and buy them a bunch of palatial houses. It's a completely different thing, man. Anyway, the upshot of the article was that now was the time to ruin Doug TenNapel's career and remove him from the development of Earthworm Jim 4. But very quickly, both Tommy Tallarico and TenNapel himself spoke out and clarified that TenNapel was not actually working on Earthworm Jim 4, and that he was only involved as an unpaid consultant, which begs the question, how many more of these ex-Shiny Entertainment guys appearing in that original live stream are not really involved with making the game? Probably most of them. Actually, probably all of them at this point. In the summer of 2021, Tommy Tallarico, in a live stream at Gamescom, was asked about the development of Earthworm Jim 4. At that point, he had to admit that development on the game had essentially stopped in order to prioritize the development of the Amico's user interface and its launch games. And unfortunately, the Intellivision Amico itself seems like a pretty iffy prospect at this point. After repeated delays and going into millions of dollars of unpaid debt, Tommy Tallarico stepped down as the CEO of Intellivision in February of 2022, and the company's new leadership has revealed that they need to raise an additional $10 million from investors by this summer, or else the entire enterprise is finished. And yet still, there's no set launch date for the console, which is still undergoing changes at both the hardware and software level. And after 4 years of development and endless talk, there's no actual product. Will investors be willing to throw down $10 million to launch a new video game console in 2022 or even 2023? After all of this? Not likely, man. And therefore, I don't think we're getting Earthworm Jim 4 either. This game's supposed to be custom made for the Amico, but let's be real. The bigger issue here is the fact that not enough people care about the franchise in 2022. The original game was popular in 1994, but if I'm being honest with myself, even back then the gameplay was pretty mediocre. The graphics were awesome, but was it really that fun to play? On top of that, Jim himself was a pretty annoying character that had his place amongst a number of loud, screeching cartoon voices that all piggybacked on the ADHD-ridden cultural vibe of the 90s. But like Jim Carrey movies, it's not something you necessarily relish 30 years later, but more like something you're kinda glad you outgrew, because if you didn't, then the girls were never gonna talk to you. A few years back, Boogerman tried to make a return via Kickstarter, but wasn't able to get enough backers due to a general lack of interest. I honestly don't think Earthworm Jim would have fared that much better. Anyway, what do you all think? Is Earthworm Jim 4 ever gonna come out? Do you actually want it to come out? What's your take on the Amico? Let us know all of this and more in the comments. And thank you very much for watching. Bye bye now.